for me, it's like the idea of transness is about the movement across a socially imposed boundary that like tries to fix you in place by telling some story about what your body means.
What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
I'm very fortunate to have gotten a bit closer to Susan Stryker since she first appeared on an early episode of this podcast a couple of years back. Susan's an historian, an author, and also someone without whom there would be no trans studies, I believe. I was thinking back to the first time I ever heard her name, and it was actually because of work that Quit, Queers Undermining Israeli Terrorism, was doing to get the Frameline Film Festival here in the city to stop taking money from the Israeli consulate. Frameline is the largest LGBT film festival, and Susan was one of the people who was willing to pull her film, Screaming Queens, from Frameline's distribution arm. As of 2024, the last I checked in with Frameline, they were no longer partnering with Israel. So it's a nice example of an effective anti-pinkwashing campaign. In today's conversation, we get into a few of Susan's books, including When Monsters Speak, which is a collection of some of her work that's edited by Mackenzie Wark, who I need to get on the podcast, another great author. And in When Monsters Speak, there's a bunch of pieces about living in the Bay during a time when I didn't live here, but a time that I sort of idealized because of what I know, thanks to people like Susan and other friends telling stories of this time, San Francisco in the 90s, or as Susan dubs it in one of the pieces, the Trans SanFrisco of the 90s. We're also going to speak to the new third edition of Transgender History, which comes about 10 years after the second. In the introduction to this new edition, Susan includes an anecdote that gives you an idea of how the atmosphere has changed since the last one in 2017. She writes about traveling and sitting down to talk to a fellow traveler whose work involves helping relocate trans asylum seekers. A few years back, this person was assisting queer and trans people in other countries who were fleeing their homes for the US. But now they're actually helping trans people get out of the US. And before Susan comes on, I just want to say thank you to Nathan, who is helping to keep the dream alive at patreon.com/SanFrisco, the place you too can go to donate to this little project. I know a lot of people are broke right now, so it means a lot when people bother to throw down $5 or whatever you can to help me and to help Tyger, our editor, to continue to do what we do and put out this podcast in a semi-regular fashion, along with all of the social media, news, and like informational edutainment that I try to put out every day. So you were talking about your new book, which comes out in August. We're going to be talking about a couple other books that have been recently released, but about these like deeper questions about truth. Could you give people a little preview of what this new book's about?
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me on. I always appreciate
Thank you for
listening to San Francisco, and I've enjoyed the time I've been on it before. And yeah, hopefully I can be back on it again later when I've got another book to flog. But because the conversation here is always really good. So yeah, I mean, we were talking a little bit before we started recording about the fact that I've got 3 books in 3 years, which, it's like now that I'm a retired professor lady and don't have a day job, I can actually get something done. The book that came out actually in 2024 was a collection of previously published essays called When Monsters Speak, a Susan Stryker reader. That was edited by Mackenzie Wark, and I am very pleased to say won the Lambda Literary Award for best work in LGBT studies.
Hey.
Woo woo. So I thank Mackenzie for that. And it was mostly an anthology of work that came out of, what I call, Trans SanFrisco in the 90s. So a lot of stuff that was originally published in queer zines, and, a lot of it's very sexually explicit. It's very subcultural about trans and kink and radical community in San Francisco. And then how Mackenzie kind of curated that book was like to start with that very sort of subcultural material and then move into some of the more academic work I did about field building of, the idea of, is there a thing called transgender studies? To like, how does that subcultural, delegitimated ways of knowing, that comes from how you live your body in the world, how does like that help change the academy, and more formal to like fields of knowledge, and then finally winding up with some of my more sort of auto-theoretical work, particularly the essay that I wrote on Frankenstein, which seems to keep having a life of its own and doing its own thing. It's something that I wrote in like 93, I think it was, that still is still leaving its mark now. I just got a Google alert on my name last week. There is a band in the UK called Top Shortage, a post-punk band. They just released their first album, and the lead single on that album is called Susan Stryker, and it's drawing on that Frankenstein essay. So Granny Tranny still got it going on. Kids think I guess it's irrelevant. So
I love it.
Yeah, me too.
In When Monsters Speak, we get some pieces that are just straight out of like early like Mission District kind of, like the culture around like the Mission art scene and the BDSM scene in Soma. There's a piece from the Transsexual News Telegraph. Not sure if that still exists, but I would love to get my hands on some of the archived copies of that to check out what was happening. In particular, you referenced like how San Francisco might be feeling the birth pangs of transsexual renaissance. And it sounds like, just like kind of a utopian time. I'm sure that, I know that there were some bad things going on as well, but like just the optimism, like the kind of like creativity, people like trying different things as far as scenes and building community. It just sounds like a really exciting time to have been in the city.
Yeah, it felt that way to me. And we'll segue in just a minute to like the other two books, the one I'm ostensibly here to talk about. But for me, I felt like that first half of the 90s moment in San Francisco feels in many ways very similar to now. I mean, now it feels worse, but it's like I think back to the early 90s. It's like the AIDS crisis was still going on. They didn't have the retrovirals yet. People were dropping like flies. If you got an HIV diagnosis, it was pretty much a death sentence. Within a very short time frame. The U.S. is like had started its first, overseas wars really since, the Vietnam era. With the war in Kuwait, and Iraq. So just like it felt like bad things were happening on a big scale, and it was also like very, close at home to the queer community. There was this sense of new possibility. The internet was young, just like we hadn't learned to be cynical about it yet. It was kind of like, oh, like this whole new, way of dealing with, information and knowledge and connection. The Soviet Union collapsed in that period, and like there was this sort of moment of what the chairman of the Fed was calling like the irrational exuberance of global capital. Like there's just like everything seemed like up and for grabs, and it's like, but clearly it was like the recent past and present had these things in it that felt like they could not be survived somehow, that it just wasn't working, and there was this sense of like you turn towards the future as like this space of possibility, because you got nothing to lose by getting, like by jettisoning the present and past and orienting yourself towards, what felt like a livable future, a livable way of life, and that's kind of what I feel like right now. I mean, given the current political crisis that we are in, it's just like there is no downside in saying like, what the United States has been, what capitalism has given us, just like there's like nothing to hold on to here, like there's like, it's like let's just scrap this shit and move towards a way of being people with each other that feels like a good way to be, because what do you got to lose? No incrementalism. So
And
that was very much
people were trying new things, basically.
Pretty much the mood, for me in the early 90s, and it really feels like it resonates now. So I think it's a good time for that old writing to have recycled, back up to the current moment. The other book that you mentioned, the one that's going to be out in August, it's called Changing Gender. And my elevator speech version of what it is an auto-theoretical intellectual history of the gender concept. And what I mean by that is that it's written in a very sort of first-person subjective voice. I can't seem to write any other way, where I bring, my own personal observations and reflections on things that I've experienced or know, not as a way of sort of centering my own personal voice, but by saying it's like, like there's things that we directly experience that like we can think about, and it's part of our understanding, it's part of our analysis, and we should not ignore that kind of lived embodied experience and how we like theorize our situation in the world. And I just don't seem to be able to write in any other way than that. So using that style of writing, I'm writing about the history of the gender concept itself. And, where this came from is that the book was initially supposed to be kind of a long historical narrative of, sort of like people who've changed genders in what's now the United States from the colonial period forward. It's kind of like a big, long, narrative arc. When the book was first sold, it's a trade publication, so it's coming out from one of the big commercial publishers. And when they bought the book, that was in 2016. And I know that what my literary agent and the press were thinking, that their frame for the book was, hey, these trans issues are like all over the media right now. Look at that. Laverne Cox has been on the cover of Time magazine. It's like, trans is this new thing. Come here, trans person, like tell us the story of how you got here so we can, welcome you to the table of social inclusion. And that was, that was why they thought a book on that topic would be timely, right then. My perspective in wanting to write it was basically to say, there's actually been some progress on this issue, at least for some trans people in some ways. It's like, and you don't want to discount your actual, victories in the world. But my perspective was, uh, a lot of the celebratory attention to transness at the time was, kind of a very sort of shallow and superficial, kind of take on
Mm.
diversity and inclusion, and that, there was a lot of things that, shouldn't be celebrated. Like that anthology, Trapdoor, about the sort of politics of like trans representation.
Right.
Like visibility can be a trap, like just being able to go like, hey, I'm here, we exist, is not enough,
Yeah.
that's a very double-edged sword. So, part of what I was trying to do with the original version of the book that's going to come out soon was basically to say like, yes, progress, but not good enough. And that was a book that was written at a time when I think everybody was assuming that Hillary Clinton was going to be president, that a kind of neoliberal form of capitalism was going to continue, that there would be kind of a bland, centrist, democratic administration, and what we got instead was an incipient form of fascism, and that when after Trump was elected, it's just like that version of the book that I had been commissioned to write. I just thought there's no, that's not the book that needs to be written right now. And I think one of the, and so I started rewriting the book, and it took me a while to do it. But the big conceptual shift for me was to move it from, I am writing a book about people who have changed genders, to a book about how has the idea of gender itself changed, because like that's the framework. The idea of the gender concept is the frame, and that if you're not agreeing on what the framework is, it's like having empirical knowledge, like the knowledge that there was a person who like took hormones at a certain time and they used that to like change their legal gender designation, and this is something that happened in the far past, like 100 years ago. It's like that knowledge doesn't really do much if you're having these sort of big culture war debates over, what counts as true and real in the first place, when you've got people, basically saying like, transgender is not a legitimate category of personhood. It's ontologically impossible to be that, there's biological reality. And, it's like, if you're not able to talk about how we come to like understand and produce what we experience socially and mentally and intellectually as true and real, then you can't have a fact-based conversation. Like you have to talk about how we're in this historical moment where the truth status of knowledge is something that is being politicized and weaponized. It's like we don't all live in the same reality, and like that fracturing, that epistemological fracturing, is part of, to make it personal about trans, it's like it's a part of how trans people become oppressed, because it's like our lives become the site, or the battlefield for these struggles over, the nature of, truth and reality, and what's, ontologically possible and what's not. So, that's kind of what I leaned into in the book, is like thinking about the relationship between how the concept of gender itself, I mean, I trace its history, back into grammar, as like the term actually comes from grammar, like how you sort nouns and pronouns into categories and make meaning by showing how but by changing the form of a word so that it resembles the form of other words in the sentence, so which words are related to each other. Well, don't need to go into the boring details of the way grammatical gender works. It's like putting an O or an A at the end of a word, like in Spanish, like that's grammatical gender.
I think, but yeah, at the same time, like these are, the question around, words, linguistics, that's a huge part of why you kind of like need books like the one that you're putting out later this year, but also Trans History, which itself opens with a sort of caveat around how representing the history of all trans people is a near impossible project, maybe an impossible project. And so you call for like a very wide definition of transness that's guided by self-determination. And I was hoping, for the cis listeners out there who are otherwise uninformed, could you describe why it's necessary to include a sort of caveat like this?
Sure. And I'll just say right off the bat that this third book that we haven't talked about yet, Transgender History, is I would say it is really aimed to a significant degree at a cisgender audience.
Yeah, I was wondering.
That's the roots of the book. It was first Seal Press came to me like in 2007 or so. So we're developing a series of books to use in, feminist studies, women's studies, classrooms on, emerging topics. Like there was a book on, feminist hip hop, or like a book on girlhood studies, or, many different titles. And they asked me to develop a book for them on transgender history from a feminist perspective. And, I kind of banged that out, almost like it was a series of undergraduate lectures, like there's even a section at the beginning of the book with like, terms and concepts, so was very much envisioned as a kind of teaching text, aimed at a, sort of undergraduate and high school audience. But, also, for anybody who's kind of new to the topic and kind of wanted a good place to start. I mean, I really thought of it as a introductory text. And so part of that was, trying to define like, what do we even mean by transgender? And the way that I have always found it useful to think about is to like not get too hung up in hair splitting, taxonomic divisions between different kinds of transness, the cross-dressers or the transvestites or the butches or the femme queens or the transsexuals or the non-binary people, whatever. It's like there's ways that we can all get like very narrowly identitarian about,
For sure.
who's the real one, or like which one's better, or it's like, and I just really wanted to avoid getting too mired in those kinds of terminological distinctions. I mean, not that, everything that can be grouped under the impossibly broad category of transgender, it's like that everybody has the same sets of interests, I mean, there are really significant differences between different flavors of transness. And yet I still feel like there's a utility in thinking very broadly about different kinds of people who have a common stake in resisting the way that we live in a society that wants to kind of weld us all into place in a social hierarchy by the way that it uses these kind of biologically determined categories, whether that's race or whether that's sex classification, as a way of, kind of naturalizing the idea of a biologically based hierarchy, and so for me, it's like the idea of transness is about the movement across a socially imposed boundary that like tries to fix you in place by telling some story about what your body means. And so in that sense, so transness is that movement across the socially imposed boundary, and so, I think that that's not only useful for talking about different flavors of gender transness, but also a great way for bringing together at a conceptual level questions about racial liberation and about feminist reproductive politics, that it's kind of like saying, like, I know what my body is like. It just doesn't mean what you say it means. It's like, it's not for what you say that it means. It's like, there's this sense of a self-motivated, desire and practice of moving across the socially sanctioned meanings of your body towards some notion of some practice of, freedom and liberation. And I think if the more we can focus on the broadness of what transness can be, as a way of navigating, moving through, the way power wants to act on bodies of bodily difference and make uses of them that, don't serve the people who were minoritized by that, at all. It's like the more we can like focus on the commonality of the movement towards freedom across a social barrier, that's the vision of transness that I want to promote.
In an event that Kira and Gemma, who have been on the pod before, moderated when Monsters Speak, the first book we spoke about came out. You predicted some of the trans history erasure attempts that we have really seen come to pass since that event last year. There's government removal of trans people from the Stonewall Monument in New York is, obvious physical example, just taking it straight off of the National Park Service's signage. You also have like the digital erasure, or like banning and shadow banning by some of the biggest internet platforms out there. Like, for example, Elon Musk decided to make cisgender a slur. So on Twitter, X, this place where unfortunately still there are some people out there who are getting some of their news and information through Twitter. The word cisgender will either have your post on Twitter not appear, or the algorithm will it disincentivizes you from using a term like cisgender. And so I was wondering, as a historian, I'm sure we've seen some precedents for this. I think of immediately like the Lavender Scare and McCarthyism back in the 60s. What do you think in terms of looking back and seeing precedents around what's happening now with this censorship?
Oh, those are great questions, and they're complicated questions. And I think there's actually two things. I mean, there's two separate things at stake there. One of them is just the idea of censorship in the media and the control of media environments that like make some things not as legible as they could be, not as findable as they could be, certain kinds of content being suppressed. And I think the maybe the best analogy for that is like, or not even the analogy because it's still very much present, is the passage of the so-called Comstock, law back in the 19th century. There was somebody who, like, they made it a crime to use the federal mails to distribute obscene materials and abortifacients. So it's like that you could not, like, to use the mail to, like, send a, quote unquote dirty magazine to somebody, or information about abortion, or drugs to use to induce a miscarriage. It's just like that was criminalized, and those that law is actually still on the books. It hasn't been enforced as much since the 1960s in the wake of some Supreme Court rulings, but it is still there waiting to be used. And there's actually some talk from some of the Christian nationalists who are, part of the federal government now, like using the FCC regulatory abilities to basically say, oh, transgender is intrinsically, prima facie pornographic, and like you can shut down platforms that promote transgender ideology the way you can shut down kiddie porn sites, and so, like that's I would say that is a latent repressive power in our government that could well be used against trans people in a much more targeted way than it has yet been used. Um, but yeah, the idea that some things are just not sayable, some topics are not covered in the media. It's like, I think that's just kind of a persistent problem. But the other half, I think, of what you're talking about is not just the way media representation and information work, but like how trans populations are increasingly targeted by the repressive powers of the state, and that it's not just censorship of information about us, but it's like it's the obliteration of records and knowledge of trans people. I mean, like the idea. I mean, I've heard people who work in Holocaust and genocide studies. Like there's a term there called the paper genocide. Where it's like it's not you're putting people in cattle cars and taking them to the ovens and gas chambers, but it's like that you're administratively erasing the presence of a population, of a minority population from the records of the nation. It's an idea that's been used a lot in colonial studies and indigenous studies. It's like, it's not like, the Taino stopped existing in Puerto Rico. It's just like you get classified out of being recognized by the state, and something very similar is happening with trans people. Like it's what the reactionaries mean when they say things like, transgender is not a legitimate, category of being, like it's impossible. A man can't be a woman. And so like you make it administratively impossible for the state to recognize the existence of a trans life or to recognize the reality of a transition from one social category to another. That is very much what's happening, not just in the infosphere and in media. It's what's happening through administrative practice. It's like, no, it's like you can't change a driver's license. It's like, no, you can't get medical treatment. No, you can't make an alteration to your birth certificate. Look, no, it's like you don't show up in this category on the census. It's like, and so that the state apparatus is not recognizing the reality of the fact that people can and do change their lives in a way that move them in an intelligible way from like one category of personhood to another. It becomes an administrative impossibility. Like that's the, the so-called paper genocide. And that is, what I think is happening to trans people right now in the US.
Yeah. And we've seen, I know that there's an organization that, classifies cultures and when they've broached the genocide barrier.
Mm-hmm.
And as I understand, for this large international organization of genocide scholars, the US is right up on that cliff's edge right now. So for the third edition of Trans History, which we have, people can go out and grab it now. When you're writing a book like this, are there parts from the first and second edition that you ended up scaling back?
I would say that the actually the movement from the first book to the second book, it was more about expansion. Like I said, that the first one was, really envisioned as kind of like a bare bones, narrative history of mostly post World War II trans history. And, honestly, a lot of it was drawn from archival research that I had done on San Francisco. So perfectly appropriate for this podcast. That first trans history book was in some ways quite either explicitly or implicitly San Fran-centric. And moving to the second version of the book, I think I would say that I strengthened and expanded the theoretical apparatus in the book. It's like, I brought in much more explicitly, the idea of, intersectional feminisms and like trace the roots of some of the arguments I was making to Black and brown feminisms, in the US. I think the second version of the book was a lot less white. That might be one way of saying it. But that I think it also had kind of a narrative problem, which is in the sense of like the publisher wanted to have a subtitle to distinguish the second volume from the first. And so the first one was just called Transgender History. The second one was called Transgender History: The Roots of Today's Revolution. And, it was written, and that was their subtitle, not mine. But that the moment at which it was written, there really still was, I think, a kind of progress narrative that was being played out of like, 2015 was like better than 2005, in terms of like trans visibility, trans civil rights activism, shift in the vibe, like kids today doing gender differently than, grandma did, like that there was still a kind of arc, an upward arc that I would say. And so I think a lot of the later part of that book, it became a like, and here's this new TV show, and like this person just got a novel published, like that it kind of lost a little bit of narrative focus because it was just this story about trans getting bigger, deeper, more, and then, like the very last bit of the book was, and then Trump gets elected and we don't know how that's going to play out. But, hey, look, at the Women's March on Inauguration weekend, there's a lot of trans, presence there, and trans issues seem to have moved into the mainstream of, sort of liberal feminism in a different way. And, got to think about that as progress, and, like who knows what the future will hold, so that was the second book. The third book, I do feel like it was a more major restructuring of the first two. I mean, it still has a lot of the same content, but I cut in the later parts of the second version a lot of the more sort of pop cultural stuff that I think proved to be a little more ephemeral. It might have seemed, in 2015 or 16. And that, I really felt like I had to go back in and change some of the narrative structure. Like in the second version of the book, there was a chapter called The Difficult Decades, and it's like kind of the way that I had written that chapter was, okay, like in the later 60s and early 70s, there was a much more kind of like militant, trans liberation movement. And it all kinds of, I think, falls apart, by 1973, 74, that you start to see fractures developing between feminist and gay and trans movements. One of the arguments I make there is like, it's in 1973, that you start to see trans people getting thrown off stages and, witch hunted out of the movement. And I think part of what's going on there is, it was 1973 that you get Roe v. Wade, and that you also get the depathologization of homosexuality. And so like cis gay and feminist people kind of felt like they had won, and then there were like these weird trans people that they didn't really have anything they had to deal with anymore. It's like, that rather than like fighting pathologization of, so-called deviants, and not having, bodily autonomy, it's like rather than couching the struggles in those terms, which cis feminists and cis gay people have a kind of common cause against, coercive psychiatrization and pathologization and lack of access to healthcare. It became more identitarian. It's kind of like, well, we got ours, good luck, to you people.
Yeah, the mainstreaming.
Right. And so, from that moment where like, which I really think of as like the wilderness years for trans political activism, second half of the 70s and much of the 80s, that it's in the 90s that you start to see, a revitalized, trans politics and movement. What I felt like I had to do for the third volume was, to not bracket that period as like the difficult decades, but really to kind of see it as a precursor of what becomes much more prominent again in the 21st century. It's in that chapter that I wrote about the origins of, what gets called TERFism, or, trans antagonistic feminisms or gender critical feminism. And, I presented it a decade ago as it's like, this is kind of like dinosaur feminism from like, this certain period in history. But, kids today, like they understand that that's all bullshit. And, just like moving on, that's a relic of the past. There's a few of the old guard who haven't like, sputtered off towards extinction. It's like, but that's definitely the past. And it's like, I really needed it to be, I really needed to say like, like there's this stuff that started in the 70s in terms of like this critique of gender and this feminist transphobia. And it's not like it ever went away. It was a little more subterranean for a while, but it really kind of flares into existence again in the 21st century. So, that was a major narrative restructuring of the book, to kind of start to tell these parallel stories, not only of like a transgender movement, but of a growing anti-trans backlash that you can like trace back into the 1970s.
Yeah, Deej from Quit, who's been on the podcast a couple times, describes that time as like the lesbian civil wars.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, always a super interesting time. Like I think, Deej at one point was living in like lesbian separatist co-op. But then, politically, like some of the discourse that was going on, it was like ending friendships and worse, like people were really losing it over these splits at the time. That said, I mean, today we have like it seems like a lot of what a big audience for this book, of course, would be in like feminist studies classes. Wondering if you wouldn't mind, letting people know why trans history pairs so well with feminist history.
Well, I think that gets back to some of the things we were talking about earlier. Like if you think about transness as like the movement across a socially imposed boundary on what society is willing to say your body means, that there's just in some ways, like if I think about it that way, then like feminist, particularly feminist, like body autonomy and reproductive politics, I think of as a subset of that trans perspective. It's like saying like, look, I know that I have a uterus. We're not arguing about my biology. I'm just saying having a uterus doesn't mean that like I'm supposed to be a second-class citizen to a man not be able to open a bank account or have a credit card or, have rights to my children if we get a divorce, or you should pay me less money, if I'm doing the same job. Like if you think about that kind of feminism that way, it's like feminism is saying, I know what body I have. I'm just saying it means something different than what you think, and that there's a political movement, to change what womanhood means. And that's feminism. So, I think of the way I think about transness and the way I think about that kind of feminism, it's like, it's the same project. And I do think both trans people and cis feminists have found great political utility in marking a distinction between, what usually gets called sex and what usually gets called gender. That the idea of like, biology is not destiny. It's like, that, sex is sex, like people do have different gametes, it's not necessarily like there's a binary sex difference, although, bodies do tend to cluster, in like two different ways of reproduction. But like there is biology, but it's like gender is the social organization of biological difference, And so I think both trans people and cis feminists, I mean, since the 1950s and 60s, have had a common project and like wanting to think about the social organization of biological difference in a way that creates hierarchy, and so trans feminists and cis feminists, I think, have a common project in that regard.
Yeah. So like three more questions, if that's cool.
Yeah.
One would be, as you were, conceiving of this third edition of Trans History, were there any nuggets that you particularly like caught your interest, that you were kind of like psyched to do research around or make additions to?
Yeah, there were. Just to hit a final note on what we were just talking about, the subtitle for the third edition was, Transgender History, a resource for today's struggle and tomorrow's, because like, I really think that's the major difference between the third edition and the first two, which is that it's written much more in a sense of, I almost want to say a post-mortem, like there was a certain trans, rights movement that was playing itself out over the 90s and the first, 2 decades of the 21st century, like a 35-year arc there. And I think that story is over. I think we are in a really different historical period right now. And so I didn't want to write about the roots of today's revolution. I wanted to, in some ways, give a kind of like, okay, like this is like what our history has been. Here's a way of thinking about it. This is what this movement has been over the last 75, 50, 30 years. And here we are, and, it's like, this isn't like this. It's not like I want to tell a story about how the past is going to continue into the future. I wanted to tell a story about, this didn't work out, so like, how do we like take what we know from the past and make it a resource for how we, move towards the future? How do we treat it as a, something that can give us critical insight into how we've arrived at the present so that we can do something different in the future? You asked a particular nugget that I liked. I was, in the third edition of the book, I expanded some of the historical frame. Like I give a longer narrative arc. In the first volume, the first edition, there was a chapter called, 100 Years of Transgender History that like basically goes from the 1850s to the 1950s. And then it, the story takes off after that. And then I expanded that. It's now like 100+ years of, transgender history. And I just give a much longer sort of genealogy of transness. And in that expanded historical narrative, the thing that I was really pleased to be able to address, just a story that I think has so much relevance for the present, revolves around a trans woman named Frances Thompson in Memphis in the 1870s. And she's somebody who had been formerly enslaved, was either like, self-emancipated or, well, we don't exactly know, but she finds her way to Memphis during the Civil War years. And in like 1866, right after the war is over, she is caught up in the so-called Memphis Race Massacre, which was one of the first large-scale like white supremacist vigilante violence acts perpetrated against the formerly enslaved population after the Civil War. It's kind of like everybody's heard about the Tulsa race riot in the 1920s, but like this was the first such event of its kind. And that Frances Thompson testified before Congress in 1866 into these hearings about the Memphis Race Massacre, where she talked about having been raped by someone she knew to be a police officer. And she was one of, I think 5 or 6 women who testified before Congress. It was the first time that Black women had given testimony before an official body in the U.S. Like they couldn't serve on juries, they couldn't testify in court, but Congress could say, we want to hear your stories. And, the first Black female testimony before an official body in the U.S. is about rape in the context of a race massacre. Just like that's what they said, right? And so Frances Thompson's testimony was actually singled out, in the publicity around the congressional hearings into the race massacre. It became part of the Northern Republican abolitionist argument in favor of radical reconstruction of the North continuing to occupy the South militarily after the Civil War. It was part of, passing the post-Civil War, amendments to the Constitution. And, it's like Francis Thompson's story played, a minor but not insignificant role in the establishment of radical Reconstruction. And then a decade later, in 1876, Thompson was outed as trans in the context of the presidential election of 1876, which was essentially going to decide whether radical Reconstruction continued. And Thompson being outed as trans became part of this narrative of like, oh, here's Francis Thompson, who testified a decade ago about being raped, in Memphis. And this is what those northern, carpetbaggers and scallywags used to like impose military rule on the South. But it was predicated on a lie, because she is a he. And if he is a he could not be raped. And so this whole argument, is bullshit. And there were stories nationwide about Francis Thompson, really being a man, and using that. They were weaponizing the existence of a Black trans woman in a political debate about whether or not Reconstruction was going to continue in the context of a contested political election, and that, like the Southern Democrats, who were the, party of the racist white South, they were saying like, oh, the Republicans, in the North, the, pro-business capitalist, Northern free labor people. It's like, if the Republicans, are so in bed with this like Black trans woman who was accused of and may actually have been involved in the sex trade. It's like, basically, it's like if these Northerners are in bed with a Black trans sex worker, they should just call themselves like the Francis Thompson Party, and they should, and so the idea that the mere existence of a trans person speaking truth to power about what their experience was is precisely what gets weaponized. And like these huge conversations about who was a member of the nation, who was a citizen, who can bear citizenship.
Super interesting. And this is, of course, the first time that I'd heard of Francis Thompson.
So the Francis Thompson story was first told in a book called Terror in the Heart of Freedom by Hannah Rosen. And that book was about the broader question of these Black women's testimony before Congress. But there's a footnote in there that says, some of the newspaper coverage of Francis Thompson suggests, she might, be what would be called a, transgender woman now. And, I'll just kind of like flag that for, future historians and people, can do with that as they will. So there's a number of people who are working on Francis Thompson these days. I mean, I know of a couple of dissertations that are in progress. It's like, I know somebody's like working on a screenplay, that her story is becoming more widely known. So it's like, I definitely just wanted to, to drop that little history McNugget, into my story, like to let people find what I think is just like one of the major untold stories, not entirely untold, but certainly not well known. And I hope that Thompson's story becomes something that like really helps us think through the complexities of race, sex, gender, class, sex work, sectional politics, the whole like U.S. story. I just think it is a really, really rich vein of historical scholarship to pursue. So I was pleased.
And so it sounds like we'll have an even clearer picture of who Francis Thompson is by the next edition of Trans History. Do you have like a calculus for like when it's time to update the book? And do you envision this as a lifelong project?
Yeah,
No,
I don't. You know, the second edition, you know, again, it was the publisher that came to me and said, "Would you think about updating this?" And it's like, yeah, there's been a lot of stuff that's happened in the last decade. You know, I could totally do that. Um, uh, so that was, publisher driven. And this third edition, you know, there's a way that I kind of wanted to do it as, I contacted my publisher and said like, "Hey, would you like a third one of these?" And they said, "Yes, please." But I think it's my last one, you know. Um, some of it's just like I feel like I'm aging out in some ways. I mean, there is a way that when you get older, it's like, your insight gets deeper, and then there's another way that I think your frame of reference becomes increasingly like not in sync with the present. There's things in the book that it's like, well, like that's in there. It would be hard to change, but it's like that's really rooted in kind of like a 90s perspective or an aughts perspective. And I just don't want to do the work of like completely rewriting the book. And I don't necessarily think that I am the person to write that book. I think, younger, fresher people with newer perspectives should do that. I'm perfectly willing to say, like, I ran my couple of legs of the relay race. Here is the baton. Somebody else like pick this up and do something different with it. So, there's I think something kind of cool at some level about going like, oh, and like my perspective is a historical one. It's like, it's like I'm happy to be relegated to history in that way.
I mean, you've also mentored like so many people over the years, of course, like through teaching and activism work, where it seems like, yeah, there's lots of people who would jump at the chance to take up some of that work too.
Yeah. So I should get out of the way and not take up so much outfield. I really not that I don't have other things that I want to say, but I don't want to do a fourth version of that book.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I wanted to end with today's conversation, going back to When Monsters Speak again. Really cool histories of San Francisco, and how at times, like, San Francisco has really been the center of the world in terms of, people working through like possibilities around being trans. And in the interview with Mackenzie Wark at the end of the book, you mentioned something that originated in San Francisco in the 1980s that could potentially help us deal with some of the bullshit that is facing us today. And I think that, Gay Shame, the activist group that I do some work with, I think some of the direct actions that we do could maybe fall under this banner of what you reference as culture jamming. Could you describe that concept and how it might help us get through some of the horrors of 2026?
Yeah. So, I mean, culture jamming in the Bay Area in the 80s, I would say basically it was like a media savvy, anti-capitalist, activist art project or movement or tendency, whatever you want to call it. It was things like, ad busters, which is, still kind of around, or there's a thing called the Billboard Liberation Front. There was a I don't want to call it a band, but like a group called Negative Land, that uses a lot of appropriated media. I think of Craig Baldwin's other cinema and some of his assemblage and compilation films, or research publications, like V Vale and Juno, and like the incredibly strange films, and Modern Primitives, and Search and Destroy Punk magazine. Like there was this whole sort of scene that was that it was about, I would say, disrupting capitalist spectacle. I see it as being kind of like an application of situationist, practices, like situationism coming out of, like Guy Debord in France, the whole idea of the society of the spectacle, and of taking ideas about, détournement, the idea of like how you like take something that is a media spectacle, something that's been commodified, and you intervene in it in a way that kind of like disrupts it from within and repurposes it. It's not just saying like capitalism is bad, we shouldn't buy things that are being forced down our throats by advertising. It's more like going like, how do you take that ad, and like blow it up in some interesting way, that reveals, to the audience, something about the way, power is working, below the surface, or how you're being manipulated, how you're in a mediatized environment that's being scripted in a certain way, so it's like, for me, culture jamming was, a way of like breaking the intended meanings of something that was being pointed at you as a consumer in late capitalism. And so, I think culture jamming was like, kind of comes out of a more sort of like punk DIY ethos. It kind of comes out of, kind of an antic and ludic versions of, the counterculture. It's a little wavy gravy, a little mime troupe, a little bit of, poking fun at the powers that be. I think it drew on, some of the kind of tech and media savvy that later gets associated with Silicon Valley, but it's like it's being repurposed. It's like so, I think of culture jamming as like in a line of development from like I said, French Situationism and the Situationist International, the May '68 events in Paris, that it's a disruption of capitalism from within through like smart, funny political disruptions of, the intent of what's being presented to you as a consumer of spectacle. So, right. So we need more of that. I mean, I think one of the problems is so many of the techniques that came out of culture jamming or situationism, it's like they've been totally absorbed, by the, the new, online, media, the algorithmization of everything. What was once disruption becomes a new way of like capturing the spectacle of disruption for the perpetuation of another spectacle. Just like it's still an interesting practice, but it has not succeeded in, it hasn't achieved some kind of escape velocity or brought capitalism to its knees.
Just like meme culture, memetics, like has been clearly very co-opted by the White House. Always gotta figure out a way of not getting absorbed by the hegemonic forces out there.
Yeah, the one that broke my heart, was an ad for Xbox a number of years ago, and that they used a song by Gang of Four, which is like back in my younger days, like 79, 80, it's like Gang of Four was like maybe my favorite band for a while. And they have this, very sort of aggressive sounding songs as the problem of leisure, what to do for pleasure, ideal love, a new purchase, this heaven gives me migraine. Those were the lyrics. It's like, and they use that song as an ad for Xbox. It's like ideal love, a new purchase. It's like it completely lost the irony and the critique. That's what the band was doing. They were saying like, we, from a Marxist perspective, are, like making fun of the commodity form, and we are using the form of a pop song that you can dance to in a club to critique the very thing, the medium that in spaces that we're circulating in. And then they use it to sell Xboxes. And, I hope they made a lot of money,
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that's always the where the trouble lies is figuring out how to do the things and build cultures where like it keeps people coming back, but without that being instrumentalized by the powers that be for evil.
Yeah, deterritorialization is a constant practice.
Yeah. Yes. Great place to end. Thank you again for writing all of the 3 books that we have discussed today. And we'll have links in the show notes to those. One isn't out yet, hopefully.
Some of the advertising pages are up, like on Bookshop or even Amazon or whatever, so you can link to pre-order. And yes, I would love to come back in the fall sometime and talk about that. That once it's out.
Cool. All right. Thank you. And we'll speak soon.
Pleasure. Keep up the good work. Love San Francisco.
Thank you for listening to the show, and especially thank you to everyone who is contributing over at patreon.com/SanFrisco. You're making it possible for San Francisco to exist. And if you're not already a member, think about joining. Again, it's patreon.com/SanFrisco.